Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Mim Harrison. I'm a friend of Books and Books. On behalf of Mitchell and Christina and the whole Books and Books team, I'd like to welcome you to our conversation on America's Bilingual Century with our author, Steve Leveen, and our moderator, Calvin Sims. About 12 years ago, Steve decided that he wanted to learn another language. But it became more than just a casual pursuit. It became a calling. So he spent a year as a fellow at Harvard. Then he did another fellowship year at Stanford, meeting with many of the leading experts on bilingualism. Then in 2017, Steve founded the America the Bilingual Project. It's an ongoing initiative to make bilingual part of what it means to be American. America's Bilingual Century grew out of this initiative. Luis von Ahn, the creator of Duolingo, calls it a book that helps language learners get over their shyness and succeed on their own bilingual journeys. James Fallows of The Atlantic calls it a book that equips individuals for a richer, more satisfying life, and is a guide for communities to do the same. And Amy Chua, the Tiger Mom, says that Steve's book could not be more timely. Read it, she says, and be transformed. In his book, Steve has many language biographies, as he calls them, of the people that he's interviewed. One of these bilingual success stories belongs to Calvin Sims. Calvin is a former program officer for the Ford Foundation. More recently, he was head of International House in New York, a place of many languages. Just last fall, Calvin joined CNN as Executive Vice President of Standards and Practices for CNN Worldwide. Calvin has actually seen quite a bit of that wide world already, thanks to a 20-year stint with the New York Times. As an overseas correspondent for the Times, Calvin was stationed in both Argentina and Japan, and that was when he mastered both Spanish and Japanese. Calvin says that to speak in another tongue is the most magical, jubilant, and gratifying of all human experiences. So who better to speak with Steve today? They will be having about a 30-minute conversation, and then Steve will answer any questions that you might have. If for any reason he's not able to get to all of your questions, check the Facebook page of America the Bilingual next week, and he will reply to them there. Steve's book is, of course, available right now from Books and Books. Just press the green button that you see on your screen. And as one reviewer said of Steve's book, it reads like a charm. Now I'd like to welcome Steve and Calvin to the Books and Books virtual stage.
Wow. After I hear an introduction from Mim, Calvin, I know why she's called the great introductress. And I realize how I have to up my game. Well, thank you, Mim. That was pretty amazing, as always.
It was, and it's good to see you again, Steve, and being able to engage in this dialogue with you. I want to start out by saying it is an incredible book that you've achieved here, and it is a necessary book, I think, for Americans in particular. And I wanted to start off this conversation with a quote from the preface to the book by David Kennedy, Harvard professor and Pulitzer Prize winner. And what he says is they who know not a second language know not their own. So I want to start with that and start with that and ask you, what was the impetus for this book? Or did you just wake up one day and say, I need to learn a second language, haven't checked the box on it? Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
Yeah, well, I went through, I grew up in San Diego, so I was surrounded by Spanish, but swimming in Spanish, but somehow never got wet. I never picked it up. Like most of my friends, it seems sort of only a nice to have and not much more than that. And throughout my life, I was sort of tapped on the shoulder by the opportunity to learn Spanish and to engage in a different world. And I always passed that opportunity up. So I don't know what it was, but in somehow in my mid-50s, I just got tired of putting it off, and I finally said yes. And then when I did, and I started studying, which I sort of describe in the book a little bit, I would just casually mention to people, like at cocktail parties, that, yeah, I'm studying Spanish now. And I got the weirdest reactions. Everybody had an opinion, very strong opinions. And they said things like, well, why bother? The whole world speaks English. Or why bother? Technology is going to make language learning obsolete. Or they'd say, man, I really want to learn myself. How are you doing it? You know, and I could see that they had the same thirst. So that's what got me started.
And Spanish in particular, because you grew up in San Diego, is that right?
Well, but I also, I doubted my abilities to learn another language. I figured Spanish was probably the closest cousin that I could learn. So I decided to go for it.
So this is this first book about championing bilingualism, and you're still going through the process of learning Spanish, is that right?
Yep.
What's that like?
Well, you know, it's exhilarating sometimes. I was watching CNN in Espanol this morning, actually, and watching a video, and so happy that I could understand the whole thing. And I read in Spanish pretty easily. That's usually the first thing that comes, is the ability to read. But now Spanish is a big part of my life. I'm still learning. I would say I'm probably advanced intermediate. So people ask me if I'm fluent, and I said, well, I can have a nice conversation with a sympathetic speaker if they're willing to correct me and fill in the gaps.
So as you know, I did study Spanish and Japanese as part of my work as a foreign correspondent overseas. And I learned in a more traditional fashion. They sent me to school for a year each time before I went to take my assignment. Tell me a little bit about your experience in actually learning. Is yours more conventional or unconventional? How's that worked out for you?
Yeah, well, I think your experience of spending a year, and this is while you were being paid by the New York Times, right?
That is correct, yeah.
So they thought so much of you that they sent you to school for a year to learn Spanish, and then assigned you in Latin America. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So I love that story for a couple of reasons. One, it shows how much time it really takes to get up to a professional competence, right? I mean, that's many hours spending. That was a couple of thousand hours. It was your job.
That's right.
For a year to do that. And, you know, a lot of people say to me, oh, I'm just not good at languages. And when I hear that, I ask them, well, how good are you at English? And I'm kind of surprised that I would ask that. And I said, well, you know, chances you can speak another language as well as you, or almost as well as you speak English. It's really a question of the hours you put in and the motivation that you have. And you had a serious motivation. You know, the Times was investing in you, and you had to do your job.
It was your job. And if you didn't, when you hit the ground, you may have a translator that can help you, but a good portion of the time, there's not somebody trailing you and being there to catch you. You've got to actually take what you've learned in the book and then actually, you know, apply it to real life situations. Yeah.
You know, that reminds me of one of those questions I got at the cocktail parties, which is, why bother learning a new language? The whole world speaks English. And so I write a chapter on that. And here's where I come down on that. You know, it's not literally true. The whole world does not speak English, but I think we have to give it its best possible light, which is it effectively true? And I think if it is actually, if you are being a tourist and traveling the major highways of the world and major international airports, hotels, trade shows, restaurants, and if you're buying things, and I don't have anything bad to say about tourism. Tourism is, we all wish we could be tourists again, right? I mean, tourism opens your mind, and it's very important economically, especially for lesser developed countries. So I have nothing bad to say about tourism, but tourism is not the most important thing that we humans do when we travel internationally. And the professional work we do with diplomacy, with development work, humanitarian work, with scholarship, with intelligence gathering, military operations, and most of all, business. And I say most of all business because it's just the quantity of people doing international business, and then journalism. So as a professional journalist, I think you realize the whole world doesn't speak English. And let me ask you this, let me turn the tables on you.
Sure.
Could you have done your job without your knowledge of Spanish in Latin America?
No, I would not be able to do it, because you can spend your time as a correspondent with the elites and government officials, but you need to know the populace. And I played a lot of soccer in South America, and improved my Spanish and my understanding of the way of life and how Latins think.
Did you play soccer, Eddie?
I did. You had to, or else they'd laugh at me. Yeah, you had to. But what happens is when you have that interaction, you start to understand the meaning of things very differently. And you can only do that by spending time with people, in my opinion, who don't speak English for the most part, and want you to understand their concepts and nuances and way of thinking, and how they're different, and how you start to celebrate them.
But then, it blows my mind that you not only did that once, but then you also got stationed in Japan. So how did you train for that?
Well, that was even more intense than Spanish. The Spanish prep was probably 3 or 4 times a week, 3 or 4 hours. The Japanese I was at the Monterey Institute, and that was 5 days a week, pretty much 6 or 7 hours a day, including some cultural enrichment and lots of drills, and then collaborative speaking with others who were studying Japanese at that time. But once again, if your employer is stationed you there to learn Japanese, and you need to learn how to read and to write, then you're going to do it because that's part of your job.
Yep.
Tell me if you, Will, you said in one passage that you set out to write a book that you wished the other people had written before. What was it that you were seeking that you've now provided in your book?
Yeah, well, there are plenty of books, of course, written about how to learn Japanese or how to learn Spanish, but there's not very many books at all written about how to learn a language in general. And back at those cocktail parties, I was hearing a lot of comments about people that could really stop a language learner. Like, for example, the only way to learn a language is total immersion, implying that if you can't do that, then you might as well give up. And so that's what set me on the path to trying to answer some of these questions. I wanted to argue with the people who said I was wasting my time, and I wanted to help others who were trying to learn. And so that's what set me on the path. And so the book is part 1 of the book is all for adults. How do adults really learn languages? And surprisingly, it's natural to focus on the how.
Right.
As a learner, I certainly did. It turns out it's not the most important question. The most important question is where. Where will your adopted language live in your life? You don't have to answer that right away, but you're going to have to answer it eventually. And people find that their language often shows them that place or those places. So, and then part 2 of the book is about how to raise children as bilinguals. Even
That's right. Yes.
And I'm smiling because I'm thinking of your son. Maybe we can get back to him in a second. And then part 3 of the book is all about these more sociological, the social context of learning a language and how to bat away these misconceptions and half-truths that can keep us from our larger bilingual lives.
So let's talk about some of what you call in one of the chapters, the myths about learning a second language. And you explore them pretty deeply in the book. But one of the myths is that basically everybody is going to learn English, or there's going to be an electronic translation that you can get from your cell phone. And so why even bother with that?
Right.
But tell us why that just doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of people believe that. And we have good reason to believe that, because we've all seen how technology advances so rapidly in our own lives. And if we've been paying attention, we've also seen how machine translation has improved dramatically from being pretty laughable just a few years ago to pretty amazing right now. And maybe you've also seen these demonstrations that have been done. Somebody at a keynote speech, is speaking in Mandarin, it comes out in English and vice versa. And we all say, wow, that's amazing. But here's the thing. I want to take us back just briefly to 100 years ago, when there were also performances going on, including near you in Carnegie Hall. And the audience would fill up the seats and they'd start hearing this amazing piano music from behind the curtain. And clearly this was a grand world-class pianist playing. And then the curtain would open up and the audience would be amazed because there was a person sitting on the piano bench, but they had their arms in the air and they were pedaling away at a player piano.
Yeah. Wow.
It just, from our vantage point today, it seems kind of ordinary, but 100 years ago, this was beyond belief. I mean, piano playing was seen as this essential human skill. I mean, like one of the pinnacles of human skills. And now it could be done by a machine. So what happened? Did all the piano instructors lose their jobs? Well, here's what happened. First of all, Americans bought a ton of player pianos. It was like one of the first major consumer appliances. And back in the 1920s, they bought hundreds of thousands of pianos and millions of piano rolls every year. It's hard to believe, but it was only the second largest industry in America, second only to the automobile industry. But what happened is these pianos could also be played manually, like a conventional piano. And people started learning from the pianos, the player pianos, in particular, some people who couldn't afford conventional lessons, like Black Americans. And so Black Americans like Fats Waller, Stride Turner, Fletcher Henderson, and a young composer, band leader named Duke Ellington. So they studied the pianos and then they went way beyond with the piano. So what the player piano did was create a renaissance in learning, in human learning. Okay, the same thing happened in more recent history and living memory for most of us, which was in 1997. And the subject is not piano playing, but chess. Another thing thought to be out of the realm of machine ability. Gary Kasparov, the reigning grandmaster, sits down next to IBM's Deep Blue. We all know what happened. Deep Blue won. What happened to chess? What happened to chess was, again, a renaissance.
That's right. Yeah.
The computer programs became plentiful and inexpensive, and a new generation, including the current reigning grandmaster, Magnus Carlsen, who was born in 1990, grew up with these games, became the youngest grandmaster ever, and the highest scoring ever, and he's not alone. So here's the thing with technology. We kind of worry about it when it gets close to human abilities, and then once it does, we go, forget about it. We don't care what machines can do. We care what we can do. And so we use machines to make us better. So a long answer to the question. I'll just finish by saying that what machine translation will do is it will lead to lots of translation. I mean, if you and I are going to the Philippines together, we're going to use that to help us speak Tagalog and have some niceties and buds of bilingualism. But I use my Google Translate multiple times a day to help me with my Spanish. And sometimes I get it hilariously wrong, and sometimes I get it right, and I'm really happy. And so that's what's going to happen. We're going to use machine translation to get ourselves to learn languages more rapidly, with more satisfaction and more languages. It's what we humans do.
Right. But nothing, if I could, inject this, nothing though no machine, no technology can really get to the nuances. If you want to put an ito on something in Spanish, or a samba, which is an honorific for the person you're speaking to, a machine doesn't know how to do that and do it correctly and appropriately at the right time.
There's that. You're absolutely right. And there's also, what does it say to someone you're talking to when you're struggling with their language? It says that you care enough to show that you're vulnerable, show that you're human, so that you're willing to embarrass yourself. Technology can't do that for us. That's something we have to embarrass ourselves and lower our defenses. And I'm sure you saw it as a reporter, how important that was, or I'm guessing you did.
Yes, you do. And what I like the most, if you're having a beer or a glass of wine and you've just arrived for your assignment, your language skills are okay, but they're not good. You're a little bit tense about what you're going to say. You're a little bit formal. And usually they will tell you, have another glass of wine and just relax. And we'll correct you if you move off center. And that is how you learn a language. It's that interaction that takes place. I wanted to go back to how Americans who are the children of immigrants who speak other languages, and that interplay. My wife is Haitian, and our son, Marcel, has now started speaking both languages and very fluent in both, and using the Haitian French to his own advantage to butter up his mother. Talk a little bit, if you will, about that legacy of having parents who are immigrants and picking up their language. Is that easy? Is that common? Do they reject it? Talk a little bit about that, if you will.
Yeah. Well, the American story, the American narrative is that our patriotic immigrants of yore, 100 years ago, actively discouraged teaching the heritage language to their kids. And it wasn't that they were any more patriotic than today's parents. What they were was practical. And back before the 1950s, the chances of you going back to the home country and using the language were slim to none before inexpensive air travel. And the technology today were letters that took weeks or months to arrive. Contrast that today, when, absent the pandemic, air travel is plentiful and relatively inexpensive, and technology, like we're using today, is instant and free and ubiquitous. So today's immigrant parents recognize that it's not only practical to raise their kids bilingually, but advantageous for them to do so, not only in terms of family cohesion, but because they know they can get better jobs and have enhanced careers. And so the immigrants in recent decades have, of course, want the same, they want what's best for their kids as they did 100 years ago. What's best for the kids today is bilingualism. And we're seeing this in the numbers. And this is when I said I was so surprised in my research and crisscrossing the country that our old narratives didn't seem to fit the new reality. I was astounded by the number of bilinguals in America today. And to give you just some sense of that, if we look at the last 50 years, from 1970 to 2020, the US population increased from about 200 million to 330 million. That's about a 60% increase.
Right.
During those same 50 years, American bilinguals went from about 20 million to about 75 million today, which is 360% increase. This is mainly due to the immigration reform in the 60s and the third wave of American immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And also native-born people like yourself who learned a language successfully, and or two languages successfully. So, we still have this kind of inferiority complex. Americans think, oh, we suck at languages, and in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
everyone speaks 4 or 5. It's just not true. There's a lots of monolingualism in Europe as well. And when you actually look at the numbers, there are more American bilinguals than any European country. And it's because of our scale. Not only the quantity, but the diversity.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's we don't have to be apologetic about our language in America. We should be very proud of our language skills in America and get psyched up to grow them, which now we have all the tools to do that.
So you recently wrote a blog in which you pointed this out, that bilingualism, as you put it, is patriotism by another name. And how did you reach that conclusion? And then how do we make that more evident to Americans?
Well, language skills are skills, right? So generally we like to have skills in our populace. But the reason it's another word for a patriotism in my book is, first of all, let's look at the US military, which has consistently put a lot of resources into language training, including at Monterey, where you studied Japanese. And they do that because it's important to the country militarily, for intelligence gathering and military operations. Let's look at first responders, police, fire, paramedics. There is a bilingual advantage and usually an increase in pay for bilingual first responders because it can be a matter of life and death. Let's look at teachers. The exciting thing happening in American schools today is the growth of dual language schools, which is where the students are taught part of the time in English and part of the time in another target language. I imagine that Marcel will maybe go to an English-French school and do well in both languages. So not only will he speak it, but he'll become biliterate and earn the seal of biliteracy, which is now spread around the country. So, if being a teacher, being a first responder, being a U.S. military, if you think those are patriotic jobs, bilingualism is what can enhance those careers, enhance those jobs, and for our communities and for our country.
Well said. So I think at this point we want to move to take some questions from our virtual audience.
Okay.
Okay.
This is a question from Caroline, and she asks, how much time, since most of our language, wait a minute, I'm sorry, I'm very sorry. How much time should I anticipate putting into a new language? Is total immersion required, or is this something I could commit 20 minutes a day to and see results?
I would say yes, you can commit 20 minutes a day and see results. I think the important thing is to be doing something every day. I really recommend taking a long-term approach to language learning, which is why I recommend adopting a language. So you're going to have some days where you're just too busy to get to it, and other days where you really just have a wonderful learning experience. But to answer the question about hours, as Calvin experienced having as his full-time job for a year, that's about 2,500 hours. That's it's hard to do that 20 minutes a day. So you can make progress at 20 minutes a day, but I would recommend finding other means. And here's something else I'd recommend, which gets back to the where and where the language will live in your life, look for things that you want to do anyway and do them in your adopted language. For example, when Calvin was living in Buenos Aires, he loves playing soccer. So he's, getting exercise, improving his soccer skills, and improving his Spanish skills. I bet you learned some bad words.
I did. Good bad words.
Good bad words. Yeah. And so if it's cooking you love to do that in your adopted language. If it's taking hikes you love to do that in your adopted language. So it's not only the learning per se of studying, but how you can also learn by not studying and just by doing things that you love in your language.
We also have a question from Fernando, who says, since most of our language learning is contingent on being in front of people, mostly strangers, what were your strategies to keep on practicing a language during the pandemic? And which ones do you think should exist if, God forbid, another pandemic hits? We'll hope not, but.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. As the technology gets better and better, we are meeting virtually as we are right now. There are websites like italki is one of the ones I like. It's a Chinese company where you can start working with language teachers all over the world in probably 40 or more different languages at pretty reasonable prices. And you can get one-on-one interaction with a human. It's virtual. But I think one benefit perhaps of the pandemic is that it has forced us to become more serious about what are best practices for virtual learning and virtual interaction. That said, there's nothing like being face-to-face, cara a cara, and that will return. And, I think the point of all the technology, by the way, is to get us over our shyness. As Luis von Ahn says, the point of Duolingo, he says, and I quote him in the book, is to get the 80% of people who are shy comfortable enough so that they can begin having genuine conversations with other humans. I
would just add just quickly that also watch a movie that you may have watched in a different language that had English subtitles. Watch it without the subtitles, or turn into a news program, on cable, which has, thousands of channels in the language that you're studying.
Like CNN en español.
Exactamente.
Yeah. And that is one of I'm glad you mentioned that. It's one of the blessings of our age and why, in my opinion, we live in the golden age of language learning, or just beginning the golden age of language learning, because we can watch our news in our adopted language. We can watch series on Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever, or streaming service, and change the subtitles, change the voice often. And I devote a chapter to that in my book. It's one of the greatest things for language learning. It wasn't designed for language learning. Mm-hmm. It was designed because companies want to be as international as possible. But it's an absolute boon to language learners.
Calvin, this question is for you. This is from Gene. And he says, I also studied Spanish and Japanese, became fluent in Spanish, but after 2 years did not continue with Japanese. Reading and writing were a particular hurdle. Also, I felt that I would forever be a gaijin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, meaning foreigner in Japan. What was your own experience with these two very different languages?
Well, actually, I found them not too different in terms of pronunciation, once you could get the rhythm of them. It was a different way of conceiving the grammar, oftentimes, and the honorifics that you would add to them. But the writing and the reading, were probably the most difficult part of it. I could write much better than I could read. And then there were some shortcuts, because sometimes you can use the basic hiragana and katakana, which they would turn it into the kanji. So I could cheat a little bit with the technology by not having to write all of the kanji. But I kept them both for the most part, just because they were very prominent in the place I grew up in, Los Angeles, and I had invested so much time that I would make sure that I would, have time at least once or twice a month to actually speak the language with friends or people that I knew.
Yeah. This is a question from Diane, who says, tell us about the mental health benefits of being bilingual.
Yeah. Well, there's been a lot of activity. Let me back up a little bit. Back before the 1960s, bilingualism was thought to be bad for children. And there were actually scientific studies, and doctors and teachers might recommend to parents that don't confuse the child with another language and just stick to one. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until the 1960s, and Peel and Lambert, two Canadian social scientists, figured out that the studies were flawed. And when they did the studies correctly, they found that the students were performing at higher levels, the bilingual students compared to monolingual students. That began a whole flurry of studies of what is it about bilingualism. And what they've discovered is that there does seem to be enhanced mental performance for children, and maybe an increase in empathy, definitely an increase in the ability to learn new languages. And these mental health advantages seem to last throughout our lifetime. Another Canadian scientist by the name of Bialystock, Ellen Bialystock, has studied and documented the delay of the onset of symptoms of Alzheimer's in the bilinguals she studies compared with the monolinguals by 4 or 5 years. So who wouldn't want that?
Yeah, that's really powerful. Kelvin, this is another question for you. And actually, it's probably more for Marcel, but we'll let you take it for him. All right. Marcel could also go to a community-based heritage language Saturday school. Do you know of any?
I'm a first-time parent, and we're just sinking our teeth into all of this. So I don't know any currently in New York, but New York seems to have a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are these types of programs. I know that there's a Japanese cultural center here in New York City, and they do offer these types of classes for children whose parents are working or living in New York City, and then for anyone who wants their child to learn how to speak Japanese, they do offer those.
Yeah. Oh wait, we have another question I think just came in.
Let me just add something to the New York. There's a fellow, Fabrice Jeannot, who wrote a book called The Future of Education is in Two Languages. And he's based in New York. He's the New York Times has called him the godfather of dual language schools. And he's a great treasure of resource to lots of parents who have lobbied successfully to create dual language programs in Brooklyn, and I'm sure in Manhattan as well.
This question is from Nadera, and Nadera, I hope I pronounced your name properly. And she said, where did you find the most difficult aspect of learning a new language as an adult? Pronunciation, grammar, logic of the language, all of the above? And what was relatively easier than you imagined?
Well, I can answer that a little bit, and then maybe you can too, Calvin. Spanish is a pretty close cousin to English for many of the vocabulary, which is great. The grammar is quite a bit different, and word order is quite a bit different. I think what pulled me along were the delightful and surprising discoveries along the way, where something I just took for granted in English is said a completely different way. Like I was reading this book once, and it describes Amelia Earhart as a child got so fascinated with Montagna Russa, which is a Russian mountain. And I'm thinking, she's at a carnival. what is a Russian mountain? Well, the translation is roller coaster. I mean, and then it gets you thinking, well, why is roller coaster the right name? That's kind of silly. Why not call it a Russian mountain? And these kind of discoveries happened over and over again, and they just delight me and pull me along. Calvin, how would you, what was most difficult and easy for you?
Well, I think, in all honesty, the homework that one had to do for Japanese with kanji, and that involves just writing the symbols over and over again and then being tested on them. And so you sort of feel like, I'm done with college and graduate school. What am I doing sitting here writing these kanji? But, you know, there is a method to it, and it increases your vocabulary, your creativity, once you understand these symbols and how they relate to the language. So that was the most strenuous part of it, but you had to do it. And once you got the hang of it over time, you were so proud to say you knew X number of kanji. And it was sort of a badge of courage. I'm making my way through it. Yep.
And I'll add one other thing, Mem. You know, there's a lot of language classes that might advertise, you know, learn French fast and, you know, be fluent in 10 days or whatever it is. And there will be times where your learning is very fast and fun, and that's great. And there'll be other times where it's slow and hard. And don't be afraid of that. The productive struggle is when you often learn the most. And good language teachers and tutors, when you're struggling, you're trying to say something, they'll just sit there and be quiet. And they'll let you struggle a while, because that's what's building those neurons. And not only are you learning a language, you're probably improving your mental health too. And yeah, so.
We have another question, and I think time-wise we'll have to make this our last question, but it's a good one. This is from Tom, and he says, the ancient philosopher Diogenes once said, "I am a citizen of the world." It strikes me that at our odd social moment, when so many Americans seek to hunker down in their tribes, learning a new language might expand consciousness and have a mitigating impact on the centripetal forces of our day. Of course, those who would most benefit will likely be least open to it, but many of us could become ambassadors of understanding if we tried. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this speculation.
Wow, he just sounds like a philosopher.
He does indeed.
I would say this, that no country can compare with the United States right now in terms of the quantity of our bilinguals and the diversity of our bilinguals. Particularly in the last wave of immigration, it wasn't just Europe anymore, it was the rest of the world, the Asian countries, the Middle East, and Latin America. And so I think we can already be proud of the American bilinguals we have. And I think we have all the tools, including dual language education and great technology and great language teaching. Language teaching is also improved. It's not your uncle's Spanish class anymore. It's really, teaching has gotten better, that we have this kind of perfect storm of opportunity now for Americans to expand on our strengths and have a flourishing bilingualism that will, among other things, enhance our soft power within the world.
That's great. Well, I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up. It's really hard to leave such a great conversation. I just would like to say to our viewers one thing. You know, even if you are not bilingual or haven't even considered bilingualism, this book is such a great read. And what's wonderful about it is that Steve does take you through his own journey and his own pain and some very funny moments that he's more than happy to share with you. So it's kind of nice being talked to about bilingualism by someone who is still aspiring to it. And I think it makes it that much more friendly for all of us. So again, if you would like to buy the books, the best place to buy it is, of course, Books and Books. We would love to have you do that. I hope everyone has enjoyed the session today. Steve and Calvin, thank you so much. This was really great. And I just, again, would like to thank Books and Books. Thanks so much for hosting this. And thanks for keeping so many of us sane during this past year with your wonderful events. So hopefully we'll see each other soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am, thank you, Calvin. And
No,